I'm sitting on wooden floorboards in a bright ground floor room in a house in North London. Around me, pens, cutlery and other objects of various materials sit carelessly idle. Towering above is the colossal wooden frame of a piano, stripped naked, internal organs exposed as if undertaking a surgery of sorts.
The smell of sweet resin and dust and age whisper from its open chasm.
Inside, the delicate spindles of a great iron harp traverse its length.
The ribs of a second array fixed patiently just behind. The piano stool, abandoned in the corner, makes no protest. I hold a spoon in hand, poised.
The sound world that now begins has no equal. Great echoing leaps of metal and wood cascade across the room, splashing kaleidoscopic puddles across the floor like skittles.
Bounce and tension, brittle and fire.
I play in the vast murky depths of the stark husk.
My accomplice in the tinsel heavens. Percussive suggestions from my knuckles and palms punctuate and interrogate.
Pitch tremors tickle wrists, arms and elbows like ice cream and popcorn.
Pinning to the floor,
a pedal next to my knee propels the sonic shapes through time.
Hangs them in the air, disappears them into infinity. The wooden cage rumbles and throbs. Delicate thunder met with sweet melody daggers. A trained hand chases naive adventure. Yet behind the sound is always space. Sometimes in front, never lost. This sumptuous bubble repels time.
At least that's how I remember it. Proper piano lessons like these were so much fun.
The other ones I don't recall much, being only 8.
This chapter is an opportunity to express my own experience of this research, and this in itself can be divided into 3 main themes. The first is dyslexia. How do I experience it and what does it mean to me? The second regards my musical journey and how that also might relate to dyslexia, which then leads to Timbila music more specifically. And then the final section describes how it was for me to produce this PhD thesis. Again, what's central is how the way I think may have influenced this process. For example, why it's a website rather than a written document. There's another chapter called Process that describes the overall context of the research more theoretically, but this chapter here is more focused on the relationship between my own approach and what has emerged as a result. I had a relatively late diagnosis of dyslexia many years after I'd left school. By that point I was a location sound recordist in the television industry. So the idea of dyslexia as a way to frame my personal experience only actually began about 10 years ago. But my life prior to that is also now retrospectively different as I reappraise my education, career and interests. So dyslexia means a lot of things to me, and actually, perhaps more than anything, it's become a way to rethink how I see the world. And I certainly don't have any answers. One of the questions I ask is, what is dyslexia? Dyslexia to me is art, science, creativity, calculation, explanation, exploration, limitation, expansion, simplicity, complication, intuition, measurement, imagination, description, celebration, frustration, process, product, choice, expectation, behavior, biology, shape, color, life, history, cognition, culture, education, performance, opportunity, restriction, collaboration, separation, dimension, experience, ideology, belief, confusion, and inspiration. Not necessarily in that order, but nothing less than all these things. So after 10 years, I don't have a simple response. I think that's been one of the most interesting things actually, that itself has guided the whole research in a particular direction, towards the nature of questions and their expected resolutions. The energy of this research is very much about opening, rather than enclosing anything, not least dyslexia, into more precise definitions. What dyslexia also represents to me is the opportunity to do this research in the first place. This in itself has led to ever-deepening reflections, learning and growth. My first contact with what dyslexia meant was through Googling it. What comes up, I later discovered, is a very specific way of thinking about it, which of course is as a reading-based difficulty. This is the medicalised scientific approach, as in, here's a problem that needs solving. So that was my introduction to dyslexia. If I skip ahead to where I am now, I don't see it anything like that. The reading difficulties are certainly there, but that's not for me what it's about. And it's this research that's allowed me to recognise at least some of the many different ways of looking at it. To begin with difficulties, which is still the common ground for most people, first and foremost would be reading, especially in relation to school expectations, for example. Reading for me is mostly claustrophobic and tiring, but also a portal into a magical world. Like most dyslexics, spelling can be difficult. Although many don't enjoy writing, I actually love to write, and later discovered this is also quite common with dyslexics. Some other difficulties more broadly: concentration, organisation, memory, especially for individual facts or lists, confusing left and right, and reading clock faces. I even remember being shouted at for being late to a primary school class because I couldn't work out what the time was. In fact, my experience of time in general has always been inconsistent. In Mozambique, local minibuses leave when they're full rather than on a schedule. This felt a huge relief. Although mainstream references to positive aspects of dyslexia also exist, they're far less prominent. You have to actively search in order to tap into what's now referred to as the positive dyslexia movement. In this, dyslexic traits are all seen as trade-offs, so if you're weak in one area, you'll be strong in another. This and the neurodiversity movement, which is the idea that dyslexia is an evolutionary benefit, certainly brought deeper understandings into my frame. The best known positive dyslexic trait involves visual and spatially dimensional thinking. For me, this feels quite influential. I remember as a child having the months of the year arranged on my bedroom wall, and I still now see the year in the same shape it was laid out then. In fact, I can't not see it that way. And as there was a gap between the last and first months, I'm still surprised when the 31st of December jumps straight into the 1st of January. Seeing in three-dimensional images is also known to be common, which itself describes a big picture, holistic and interconnected processing bias. The combination of visual and interconnected thinking for me brings metaphor to life, not only in images but also in words. I've explored this throughout this thesis. In terms of memory, what's often a problem area for dyslexics is actually very strong in what's known as autobiographical memory. This means remembering personal experiences of places and events, stories essentially, but integrated into a very sensory-rich journey through the world. I always try and sit somewhere different, for example, when returning to the same place with a friend, as the different orientation of the room, the light or the sound helps me distinguish between the different events when I think back to them. I also normally remember how the energy of an encounter felt more than the other information that was shared. This memory style inevitably leads to strong imagination and vivid storytelling, hence the relationship many dyslexics have with writing. And this again is an approach I find very helpful and enjoyable. One typical example of a trade-off that dominates my world is organisation. Organising things into fixed categories can be very difficult when there always seems to be multiple overlapping options. That's a classic dyslexic trait I certainly experience, and as a result, I overcompensate by constantly organising and reorganising. So I'm actually very organised. People tell me that all the time. And I have to be, as if I'm not, things fall apart very quickly. This is really hard work. I know some dyslexics who are the opposite and would prefer not to organise at all, but either way, information overwhelm can be hugely anxiety-inducing. What's interesting about these dyslexic traits, both positive and negative, is that everyone experiences them to some degree. so really it's just how much they influence the way you think and behave. A division between being dyslexic and not dyslexic is like a line on a map, where there's no actual boundary on the ground when you walk between them. Having now researched dyslexia for 10 years, I don't feel my diagnosis defines how I'm dyslexic. I recognise enough shared characteristics, especially useful ones, to allow many different ideas about dyslexia to support my own growth and process. In fact, I don't think there's anything more important than to orientate ourselves around whichever context for dyslexia supports us the most. But to do that, we'd have to see all the perspectives in the first place. On the actual day I discovered I was dyslexic, I had the assessment and was given the diagnosis then and there. I remember it really quite vividly, walking out onto the street just feeling shaken. But because the cognitive testing and the assessment is very much centred around reading, I also remember thinking, but what about music? At that point in my life, for maybe a decade since leaving school, I spent far more time playing music than I had doing anything academic. So my first intuition was that dyslexia must have influenced my music making. And from there, the interest that ultimately became this research started to shape my ideas about what this relationship might be. It also led me to reflect on a particular experience when I was about 8 years old. I'd started piano lessons but really wasn't getting on well with the whole thing. The relationship between the notes and the music just didn't make any sense to me. And then one day my teacher, who was great, he could see that I was blocked and just wasn't enjoying it. He took all the wooden panels off his upright piano, and we sat on the floor and just played with sound inside. This is what you experienced at the start of this chapter. For me it was incredible. And that was really my first real connection with music. The first time I realised how good it could feel. I kept coming back to this memory throughout this research, and in particular when I later went to Mozambique to learn Timbila music. I think there's two parts to why it was so influential. One was stepping away from something difficult, and the other moving towards something engaging. What I was stepping away from was a presentation of music that was counterintuitive and confusing, and that in itself was mostly based around music notation. How music is symbolically presented was hugely impacting my own internal process of visualization, imagination and organisation. And for me, like actually most people, it was confusing enough to completely inhibit my engagement. I wasn't enjoying the process and I wasn't learning. So when the opportunity arose to try something different, it was suddenly very compelling. And to move away from those restrictions opened a new space for play and sound and movement and texture, all within my body. The music was integrated with my sensory world. Another interesting thing happened around that time with the same teacher. I was still really struggling, and again my teacher's awareness and creativity was amazing. He played a piece that was far more complicated than anything we'd looked at before. It was the English folk song Greensleeves actually. He must have previously seen me following his hands rather than the written music, and I think he probably just thought I could learn it like that. So he showed me the patterns and I just watched. They were actually very simple, just the white notes. And within a couple of classes I could play it, both hands together, and I thought, wow, I can play music. So it seemed to be the combination of those two things, of moving away from a confusing visual representation and of moving towards a space that involved, in the first instance, sound and play, and in the second, observation and movement. These were my doors into music. One point about dyslexia actually, it's commonly assumed that dyslexics have difficulties learning, but I think the opposite is actually more true, that dyslexics are particularly strong learners. The problem is adapting to the learning systems of others. It's very difficult to unlearn what already works so well. Reflecting on the continued influence of dyslexia throughout my later musical journey, I was curious as to what created alignment and ease and what presented obstacles. Even when I had the diagnosis, which just as a reminder presents dyslexia first and foremost as a problem, I immediately felt there were real musical strengths. I was also very aware that I struggled to remember songs, lyrics and chord progressions, even songs I'd written myself. Music notation, of course, remains a real barrier to this day. Regarding strengths, I was certainly very creative as a child. In school, I even used to learn songs by ear beforehand, and then pretend to read the music. I'm not sure my teacher ever realised. So developing these counter skills like listening, observing and creating strategies to problem solve were really beneficial. I also really respond to textures. I think this is why I enjoyed playing guitar in particular, as you can really feel the strings with the fingers in both hands. You can create different qualities with just one note. It becomes so tactile you can mould and shape it and it replies to you. And coming back to that first experience with the piano sounds, having music under my fingertips was really important to me. It was only much later I made the connection that what that piano teacher, whose name sadly none of my family can remember, what he was showing me was the importance of movement. I even remember, and it must have been around the same time, my mum writing to a concert venue where we had tickets to see a pianist, asking to sit somewhere where I could see his hands. Later learning to play guitar was a lot easier, as thankfully there's a visual language of chord boxes, which are small diagrams showing you where to put your fingers. This is the most popular way to learn guitar, to build up a kind of schema in your mind of these different shapes, rather than using an alphabetic naming system for each note. Although my first experiences of guitar were disorganised to say the least, once I discovered chord boxes, they really helped me reimagine the instrument. I also found the two-dimensional nature of the guitar helpful in terms of navigating the different chord shapes. Although on a piano the black and white notes give a slight contour, it's still mostly linear, whereas a guitar is far more spatially pronounced. Its linearity makes the piano great for understanding harmonic relationships, but to do this on the guitar is far more difficult. In fact, for me it feels virtually impossible. Even after 30 years, I still barely know the notes along 2 of the 6 strings, and even then I use colour stickers to guide me. I've also coloured my keyboard to help me. But I know the chords on the guitar because I've learnt the shapes, which are all characteristic of certain sounds, and when I play, my mind is just sequencing these shifting and revolving patterns. Interestingly, when it comes to recognising both shapes and sounds, I find it far easier to remember more complex chords because there's more points of reference. Like trying to identify a famous cityscape by its outline, the more recognisable shapes there are, the easier it is. It's actually distinguishing between basic major and minor chords that confuses me the most. What really shifted my whole perspective on music was later learning percussion. When I first returned to education, I took a music course at Goldsmiths College, and on that course I had the opportunity to play Afro-Cuban and Brazilian music, percussion being a foundation of both. That was the first time I was learning and playing these rhythms. What for me was especially appealing, and in fact this carried right through into learning Timbila music, was that the rhythms were based around cycles. These timelines, as they're called, are just another kind of patterning, but because they're not about finger shape, for example, they can be spatially imagined quite differently. They're repetitive sequences of momentums, and the repetition aspect is really important, because it meant my body could feel those momentums and then store them as memory. And if you do it enough, which you do, because these cycles repeat every few seconds, the information is embodied very quickly. What can then happen, for example, is if someone can't recall a pattern, you tell them to just play, and I've seen this several times. The hand just plays, because the body has remembered it more through the movement itself than through how the mind has tried to organise it. This is really important for dyslexics where short-term memory might be weak. In the European classical tradition, music is commonly based on longer narrative arcs, and so it doesn't have the same kind of relationship to these smaller repeated chunks of information. But cyclic musics like those popular across Africa and Latin America create different accessibility because the timelines themselves always exist comfortably within short-term memory, as well as using the body itself to store and retrieve patterns in long-term memory. While other aspects of the music of course remain challenging, I never had any difficulties with the cycles themselves. Another important aspect is perception. What these timelines also encourage is a certain perceptual flexibility. What I was taught during that course, and what already felt intuitive to me, was to hear the patterns simultaneously from different perspectives. In Afro-Cuban music, for example, one characteristic of the genre is that the main rhythmic pulse, the clave timeline, is in 2 halves, the first with 3 beats and the second with 2, all the other way round. We used to practice hearing the pattern both ways round and switching between them. Another perceptual element is that the timelines have both played beats and silent beats, essentially a rhythm that's sounded and a rhythm that isn't sounded. So another exercise that again I found intuitive was to play the sounded beats and then switch to play the gaps in between, like a perceptually shifting foreground and background. The relationship to dyslexia, both theoretically and in my own experience, returns to this idea of flexible perception, of seeing things holistically from multiple perspectives at the same time. Because of this, I'm really interested in polyrhythmic music, which is where different rhythmic pulses move in and out of synchronization with each other. Playing in a West African drumming group in London meant learning to hear the different time frames that were expressed across the players. Within this complex soundscape, to try and hear one and then the other, both set against my own phrase, was a real training. But it's fundamental within any relationship between dyslexia and polyrhythmic music. One of the key themes I return to in this thesis is how, when I encountered Timbila, a musical culture outside of my previous experience, I already had the skills I needed to engage with it. I think there's many factors involved in this. One is that my dyslexia meant I wasn't already quite so embedded into an existing musical system. I know that some trained professional musicians can struggle with other musical cultures because of their specialisation. Because they're already efficient at thinking in a particular way, taking on another system means first deconstructing your existing one. For example, orientating to a downbeat on the one count, or even counting beats at all, or thinking in terms of linear bar divisions within a single rhythmic framework. Again, this relates directly to how it's written. In Western stave notation, for example, you can change time signatures within a piece, but you can't have two simultaneously. What Chopi Timbila players in Mozambique told me is that it can be difficult for foreigners to learn the music, not so much because they're outsiders, but because they're adults. The way they think is too closed. But according to them, I wasn't like that, and several said, "You play like a Chopi." I was curious about this because I knew they weren't saying, "Oh, you play so well." They were saying I was approaching it like they do. But in what way? What it mostly seemed to mean was learning by watching and listening, and imitating their movements through feeling the body. I also wasn't counting or asking them where the one beat was, or if the time was in 6 or 8. Neither did I ask about note pitches or scales or anything grounded in music theory, just because I'd always really struggled with it, both perceptually and conceptually. I think that allowed me into the music much more quickly. That isn't to say learning Timbila was easy, or that I was especially talented, far from it. Although in many ways it was a continuation of how I'd learned the guitar or piano, my understanding was still largely dependent on how the phrase structures were broken down for me by the teachers. When I played, I often felt I was in a vortex. It was so fast, there was so much information passing through me in both visual patterns and shapes of movement. When I was learning a new piece, mental fatigue was a barrier. And playing with a full group, just keeping up was a huge physical strain. My arms would just seize up. Learning Timbila also meant learning to accept confusion. My whole process was about trying to find patterns in the music that I could understand, but because the pieces can be played so differently, it took a while to even recognise the ones I'd already learned and be able to join in at the right point. I started to perceive the music as a stream, with water flowing across the phrase terrain in different paths, or like a topographic map, where contour lines collectively spell out the complete shape. All I had to do was trace my own line. But when I came back to London to teach Timbila myself, all I had were the outline sketches for the students to copy from, not the original. I was curious to explore how much my learning replicated the family of Timbila master Stefan. The family were learning together, socially, both the music and the craft of actually making the xylophones. And it all seemed very familiar to me. This is how I like to learn, and I'm certain dyslexia has a lot to do with it. But because dyslexic traits are shared by everyone, just like autistic traits, I imagine most informal musicians will recognise much, if not all, of what I've described here. And because of how tablature notation has evolved, guitarists in particular may have similar experiences with shapes and patterns. So everyone can relate to dyslexia, because it represents one part of a human continuum we're all on. After leaving school, I spent a year at art college. I then landed in a career that had no academic involvement at all. It was very practical, very hands-on. Coming back into education as a mature master student over a decade later, really just as an experiment, and also without an undergraduate degree, was quite bumpy. I was immediately faced with the challenges of learning what the academic process was and how to engage with it. It certainly wasn't easy, and I had to make some immediate decisions about whether it was going to work for me at all. But I did continue, and off the back of that experience, I became interested in where certain points of tension were, why they were there, and what might happen if they weren't there. For the most part, I was exploring what an academia might look like where, more than just being able to participate, I might actually flourish. But universities go back to medieval times. They represent a long-standing tradition continued by many generations over many centuries. And it's a history rooted in power and the control of knowledge. Really, my own approach came down to one thing. What's more important, an idea or the box it comes in? Academia is traditionally presented in a quite specific way. Ideas have to fit it to be accepted. But for me, and I suspect many other people, shaping the form around the idea is far more important. That way, with ideas at the centre, more and different ones can be included. But actually, in the outside world, that's how it's always been. So really, the idea that this is an inventive project only has weight inside academia and reveals how stark the division is. So in part, this is about my own accessibility, but on top, I was also thinking, if I could present an example of how this might practically work, maybe it would be helpful for others and create more inclusion. The concerns of dyslexia and of neurodiversity are not separate from our collective concerns. So challenging the structural momentum within centres of knowledge production, such as universities, to keep things just as they are, also means engaging with a process of decolonisation, of how certain ways of thinking prevent other ways of thinking being expressed. And dyslexia is just one example of how this plays out. But you don't have to be dyslexic to want to work to your own strengths. The most visible feature of this research is its form as a website. It actually took me some time to arrive at this idea, mostly because it was never presented to me as an option, and so the possibility hadn't occurred to me. The advantages of a web-based format are showcased online every day. For this research, I was already using audiovisual media, and as a sensory ethnographic project, a particularly experiential quality is encouraged. It also involves music making, which is time-based and multi-sensory, and so sits well with multimedia representation. A website can house all this quite comfortably. Another important consideration is linearity, both what it means to me personally and how it impacts the research. I struggle with extracting linear sequential narratives from a world that is neither linear nor sequential. I think this is very common and comes back once again to the idea of multiplicity of perception. To permanently fix any single narrative that represents a far larger experience is where I get confused. Because every time I come back to the story, in reality it's changed. And because my own writing process is so slow, each time I return to the beginning, both the context and the meaning has evolved. This chapter is based on a transcript of a single conversation. I did it this way specifically so a single story could unfold. But only because this whole thesis retells that same story again and again in different ways, so as to destabilise any single perspective. This also concerns my representation of Chopi Timbila itself. A major inspiration to me in this regard is an online ebook produced some years ago by Heidi Gengenbach that recounts Magude women's storytelling in an area of southern Mozambique very close to where the Chopi come from. She also used a non-linear format because she felt it best expressed the way the women were telling their stories. This is how knowledge for them was constructed and shaped. So, what a website does is provide a single place to explore research through both multiple media and interactivity. This creates patterns and therefore meanings that simply aren't possible using a conventional linear printed format. Regarding shape itself, the main thesis map is a concentric circle pattern. So there's a centre point that leads outwards in every direction, although you can also see it as exterior points all leading to the centre. There's no single way to go, no incorrect route. This exploratory style of thinking is suggested to describe the dyslexic mind. And because this is how I also think, this thesis becomes a map of my own cognition. I wanted whoever interacts with it, alongside the actual content, to experience what dyslexia might feel like, or at least one person's dyslexia in one context. The invitation is then to reflect on what it adds to a more conventional doctoral thesis, and what it takes away, and then perhaps consider the value of having both. We need sequential linear processes. We also need other shapes, because when you change the shape, you change both its meaning and who can access it. The notion of boundaries is also prominent. When you explore outwards, for example, where do you stop? Consolidating this research has been a real challenge because really it's always been an exploratory process. By that I mean, more than seeking answers, I was using questions to create patterns. And so one vital reflection is that only neurodiversity, as in our collective human capacity to solve problems, can effectively respond to these complex questions of culture, knowledge and knowing. Perhaps even the difference between information, knowledge and wisdom is simply the process of including more and more perspectives. So I've designed a research project as a metaphor for how we can't produce lasting and meaningful wisdom alone, yet paradoxically I'm just one researcher. It has to be done collectively, and to do it collectively we need to keep including diversity. One design feature of the web thesis will therefore be a portal, where the whole project can reduce down to a single point and be interlinked to the outside virtual world, because this research must always be contextualized by the ideas of others. Only then can the meanings here be brought to life. This chapter has described some of the ways I think, and how that may have influenced my relationship to Timbila music, as well as how you now experience this PhD thesis. Dyslexia has influenced all of this. It's a part of both me and my process. But because everyone is different, there's no part of me that isn't also in others. The more I reflect on the nature of dyslexia, the less clear it is to me.